officials met to draw up the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. The table around which the Nazis met is still there, with the name of the person who sat at each place clearly marked, as is the alphabetical list of countries and their Jewish populations. Yet, the concrete plans to systematically annihilate Europe's Jews set in motion at Wannsee were only the culmination of years of Nazi persecution and genocidal intentions that the international community left unchecked. My mother and her brother were brought to America from Lithuania many years before the Holocaust by my grandmother. But the fate of her family that remained in Lithuania was sealed 6 or 7 months before Wannsee. In the forest where my relatives were taken to be shot, some 11,000 Jews were killed. It was still 3 years after the Wannsee conference until the war's end. And within those 3 years, most countries on that list on the table at Wannsee would be depopulated, or nearly so, of their Jewish communities. But the Nazis did not ultimately succeed in their final mission. With the liberation of Auschwitz on the 27th of January, 1945, the process of rebuilding Jewish life, of rebuilding Europe, of rebuilding democracy, of rebuilding humanity began. That her relatives in Lithuania could not be saved troubled my mother for the rest of her life. And it made her a fierce fighter against anti-Semitism. To see the resurgence of anti-Semitism that we are witnessing today would trouble her beyond despair. As we gather solemnly to remember the Holocaust, let us not close our eyes to its lessons and stand up to protect society from the persistent ills that made possible such inhumanity. The relatively few remaining survivors of the Holocaust, the most documented genocide in history, live today to see rampant Holocaust denial and distortion. We welcome the resolution initiated by Israel and Germany and passed by the United Nations General Assembly last week against historical revisionism and Holocaust denial. As we wrote in a letter to UN member states in support of the resolution, Holocaust denial is fundamentally not just about revisionist histories. It is an attempt to deny the past in order to justify present or future violence against the Jewish people and other vulnerable minorities. As we hear today from representatives of governments, of international bodies, of civil society, we must remind ourselves remembering the Holocaust and its lessons is a responsibility for all of society. In this spirit of joint responsibility, we are pleased to be joined today by Holocaust survivors and by very distinguished leaders from across the globe. Of course, while the task of preserving memory is a common one, Germany, as well as other nations whose governments or representatives were complicit, bear a special responsibility and a national duty to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust and to promote Holocaust education and research. B'nai B'rith itself, a fraternal and humanitarian organization founded by German Jews in New York 178 years ago, and which has led Jewish communal engagement with the UN since that body's own founding in 1945, has had a presence in Germany since 1882, with over 100 German chapters liquidated by the Third Reich in the 1930s. However, we reconstituted our German presence in the 1960s and have been strong supporters of the vital German-Jewish relationship since then. We sincerely thank Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, for extending a message to our event today.
Mr. Ricklin, Mr. Mariah Sheen, members and partners of B'nai B'rith International, ladies and gentlemen. 3 years ago, the historian Saul Friedländer gave his speech to the German Bundestag on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And to this day, his words resonate in my mind. In the speech, he recounts how his family fled across Europe from the Nazis. At some point, his parents considered the journey too dangerous for their son, who was then only 9 years old. They decided to hide him in a boarding school, alone. Describing the moment they separated, Friedländer thought back to his mother and father. What were they feeling when they saw their little son fighting to stay with them, and then being taken away? At this point, many in the chamber, including myself, had tears in their eyes. I was thinking of my own daughters, 6 and 10 years old. How would I have felt leaving them as a mother behind? The truth is, for someone like me, born in 1980 and living in today's Germany, this question is beyond imagination. I cannot claim to understand the horror and the pain experienced by Friedländer's parents, or by himself, or by so many other victims of the Holocaust. Friedländer's speech therefore made one thing clear to me. If we want to keep the memory of the Shoah alive in the future, we have to adapt to a new era. An era in which most people lack the experience or connections to the past to imagine how it was to live through Nazism, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. At the same time, this task is crucial. We have to make sure that we never forget. We owe this to 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered in the Holocaust, and all the others targeted by the Nazis. We have a moral obligation to remember them and their lives. But we also must not forget, in order to safeguard the future of the European democracy and of our European peace project. After 1945, our liberal democracies and European integration were created in response to the Second World War and the Holocaust. Their existence is tied to the awareness of our dark past. I quote, "If in years to come we are to remember why it seemed so important to build a certain sort of Europe out of the crematoria of Auschwitz, only history can help us." Quote end. This Tony Judd wrote as a historian. This is particularly true for Germany. Never again is a principle on which we rebuild our country in the post-war decades. And this principle remains at the heart of our national identity. Ladies and gentlemen, for these reasons, the new German government is firmly committed to preserving the memory of the Holocaust, today and in the future. We will shoulder our responsibilities and we will keep facing our past. This is why we are continuing our Holocaust remembrance work. We are supporting new Holocaust museums, for example, in Amsterdam and Thessaloniki. We are bringing young people from different countries together at Holocaust memorial sites. And we are supporting a project with the Turkish community in Germany, researching Turkish victims of the Shoah. We are also stepping up the fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion, both at home and abroad. Today, Germany is once more home to 200,000 Jews, and the Jewish community is an integral part of our society. But things are far from perfect. The publicist Marina Weisband has described Jewish life in Germany as ambivalent, full of community and solidarity, full of fear and frustration. As German foreign minister and as a German citizen, I am ashamed by the rise of anti-Semitism in my country. Terrorist attacks on synagogues, hate speech, Jews wearing the kippah being harassed on the streets of Berlin, and people carrying yellow stars with the word unvaccinated at demonstration, all of this is unbearable. We are responding to such acts with the full force of the law. And in the coming years, we will be spending €1 billion on fighting anti-Semitism and group-related hatred. with projects ranging from police training to social media campaigns. This action at home goes hand in hand with our international efforts. In the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, we will continue working through the Global Task Force Against Holocaust Distortion. And at the United Nations, Israel and Germany tabled a resolution on Holocaust denial and distortion, which the General Assembly adopted a few days ago. We need partners like you who are doing remarkable work to support Jews around the world. Joint initiatives testify to our close friendship with Israel. For the new German government, the security of Israel is and will remain inherent to our reason of state. We speak out against unfounded criticism and hate against Israel. We support the normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states, just as we advocate cooperation between Israel and Palestinians. We believe that a negotiated two-state solution provides the best prospects for both sides to live peacefully side by side. Ladies and gentlemen, in a speech to the German Bundestag, Saul Friedländer expressed hope that the Germany which emerged in the decades after 1945 would continue fighting for tolerance, inclusivity, for humanity, freedom, in short, for true democracy. Let me assure you, we will do our best to live up to this expectation. We know that peace, freedom, and democracy in Europe have historical roots that we must preserve. We are aware of our moral duty to remember all those murdered in the Shoah. Together we can fill the pledge never again with life, both today and in the future, ensuring that mothers and fathers will never again face the cruel fate of Saul Friedländer's parents having to leave a child behind to save his life. Thank you.
We thank Foreign Minister Baerbock for her address, especially at this incredibly busy moment, and for reaffirming the new German government's commitments on Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, Jewish life in Germany, and the crucial bilateral relationship between Israel and Germany. We deeply value each of these and look forward to working closely with the minister and her government. I'm pleased now to hand the floor over to my colleagues, David Michaels, B'nai B'rith's Director of UN and Intercommunal Affairs in New York, and Alina Brickman, Director of European Affairs in Brussels, to introduce and moderate today's first panel. Following the panel, we'll be honored to be joined live by United States Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. For now, David and Alina, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Dan, and hello to all of our distinguished guests from around the world. Holocaust remembrance, of course, has been a guiding pillar of the post-war international community. While today many commitments to remembrance are strong, this imperative faces growing, indeed unprecedented challenges, including apathy, a lack of knowledge among younger generations, and active revisionism. Together with our first set of respected panelists, we hope to look at national and regional responses to safeguarding the memory of the Holocaust in the United States, Canada, Latin America, and Europe. We will examine common challenges, but also best practices from around the globe. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Alina to introduce our guests.
Thank you, David, and welcome as well from my side. I'd like to invite all our four panelists on the first panel to turn on their video and microphone. And we are indeed extremely pleased to be joined today by the Honorable Irwin Cotler, Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, Ellen Germain, the United States Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, Fernanda Lottenberg, the recently appointed Commissioner to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism of the Organization of American States, And last but certainly not least, Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Commission's coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. We're grateful to have you all with us today and to be able to hear about distinct regional and national realities from you, as well as to highlight and exchange best practices in your work. I'll pass back the floor to David so we can get started.
Thanks very much, Alina. As we mark Holocaust Remembrance Day this year, we find ourselves in an environment that too many or many would not have just a few decades ago. The extent, as the minister noted, to which the Holocaust has been politicized or trivialized has been frankly stunning, most recently to vilify Israel or to dramatize public health responses to the pandemic. And this isn't limited to the extreme right. Just yesterday in Washington, I believe, Robert Kennedy Jr. implied that those opposed to COVID vaccine mandates have it worse than Holocaust victims. This co-opting in the public sphere of Nazi imagery and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories has become more commonplace. And this is something that Dan Mariashin and I wrote about in Newsweek just over a week ago. So this is our context. I'd like to invite each of you to introduce us to the scope of your work, but especially to what the current circumstances have meant for it, what you're seeing on the ground, domestically or regionally, and how these phenomena are being addressed. And Professor Kotler, thank you so much, as always, for being with us. Let me begin with you, as we know you'll have to leave us just a bit early. Your role is a relatively new one and has been further consolidated recently, as announced at the Malmö International Forum in Sweden on Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism. Please tell us a bit about your important work in Canada and what trends you've been observing in your country.
Yes, thank you for those kind words of introduction. May I begin by commending Babe Ruth International for organizing this timely and significant forum on the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as Daniel mentioned, where we commemorate the 77th anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, where there are no graves. 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die in Auschwitz. And it remains the bloody canary in the coal mine of global evil today. This historical looking glass is a perspective, is a looking glass into anti-Semitism, not only as the oldest, longest, most enduring, and most dangerous of hatred, but one that metastasizes over time, mutates and metastasizes over time, but as one foundational historical trope. And that is Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And that has related to historically whatever was good and evil at any moment in time. This also underpinned the Canadian government's establishment of a special envoy. And in my case, and in the case of the special envoy's mandate, I have 6 intersecting mandates: preserving Holocaust remembrance domestically and internationally, combating anti-Semitism domestically and internationally, heading up the Canadian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and serving also as a special envoy to intergovernmental bodies, be it the Organization of American States or the European Union and the like. And I'm delighted to be joined and join my colleagues, and I will be the beneficiary of their representations today. With regard to these intersecting mandates, one benefit has been to provide me with a holistic perspective of the intersecting character of these mandates. And this accounts, and with this I'll move to a close, of our country pledges at Malmo. Number one, education not only about the Holocaust, but about anti-Semitism. That is to say, of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, but anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate. And one cannot just study the Holocaust as a matter of historical moment, but one also has to study and combat contemporary anti-Semitism. Second, and in that regard, an annual commemoration of Raoul Wallenberg Day, Canada's first honorary citizen, where Canadians, as they were last week on Raoul Wallenberg Day, are called upon to learn about and act upon the humanitarian legacy of Raoul Wallenberg, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. The third country pledge was that of combating Holocaust denial, and in particular, Holocaust distortion, which, as we know, has been proliferating also on the social media. And in that regard, the Canadian government has committed itself to introduce legislation to combat what is in effect a rules-free order with respect to accountability by social media platforms and the like, and to combat within that framework of accountability, Holocaust denial, distortion, minimization, and trivialization. And we've seen this proliferating, whereby the social media have been weaponized for that purpose, where Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, are accused not only of manufacturing the COVID virus, but of causing its spread, of profiting from it, and the like, let alone the anti-vaxxers, and you mentioned, David, misappropriating Holocaust symbols and imagery in using the yellow star, but even worse, characterize themselves as if they were similar to inmates of the Auschwitz death camp, which is a form of Holocaust trivialization and distortion, which masks the evil and creates a threat to our democratic values and democratic institutions through this false misinformation and disinformation. And finally, as the Canadian government has put it, that we intend to do all this for the purposes of protecting our democratic values, our democratic institutions, the protection of democracy itself. In a word, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, that Holocaust distortion is toxic to democracies, that anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion cannot be combated by Jews alone, that we need a global constituency of conscience to combat it and to do so on behalf of our common humanity. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cutler. I'd like to stay with you, if we could, for just another quick moment and talk briefly about remedies, specifically legal as well as educational. Can you speak to the legal framework domestically in Canada for addressing Holocaust denial and distortions? What legal tools, if any, are available? And do you also see a longer term, perhaps more preventative approach in the field of education, public or otherwise?
Well, we have in our criminal code the criminalization of incitement to hatred, and this was held up in the constitutionality of this legislation, as well as parallel human rights legislation, were upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada in a series of landmark cases known as Keekstra et al. In 1990, I participated as an intervenant in those cases, but the court held that while freedom of speech is a cornerstone of democracy, is a cornerstone of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, incitement to hatred in the form also Holocaust denial is not protected speech. May I add parenthetically that sometimes when some American scholars speak and the First Amendment as if all speech is protected speech, even that is a mischaracterization of the First Amendment. As someone who both got his education in American law schools and taught at American law schools like Harvard, let me just say that even under the First Amendment, perjury is not protected speech because of the need for a right to a fair trial. Child pornography is not protected speech. I can go on. Fighting words is not protected speech. And in Canada expressly, Holocaust denial distortion was deemed not to be protected speech as well. The Canadian government cited our international legal obligations. Canada is a state party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence. And this was held also to be part of that incitement. And so our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our Supreme Court jurisprudence, is part of the learning with respect to education regarding the combating of anti-Semitism, hate speech, Holocaust denial, and distortion. And as I said, we have in this sense compelling intellectual and legal legacy in Canada for that purpose.
Well, thank you, Professor Kotler, and I'm sure if time allows, we'll be touching a bit upon the unique constitutional features here in the U.S. And on that note, I'd like to turn to Special Envoy Ellen Germain. We'd very much like to get a government perspective from the U.S. It goes without saying, I think, to all of us on today that both the United States is home to the largest Jewish community by far outside of Israel, and that the U.S. has been a truly indispensable and longtime leader on the issues we're talking about today. Could you give us a sense of the main challenges as you've seen them, and how this growing climate of polarization and populism, both domestically and abroad, might impact your work? And just to give us a better sense of where your position falls within the infrastructure and architecture of the US government, where do the rights and needs of Holocaust survivors themselves come into play in the form of the pursuit of material restitution for Holocaust era assets?
Yes, thank you very much, David, and thank you to B'nai B'rith for organizing this very important panel and giving me and my colleagues a chance to talk about these issues. So the Office of the Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues in the US State Department has existed since 1999. And the way we like to describe our mission is we're seeking a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. And what that involves is really two baskets of issues. One is restitution, which I think is what you were asking about just at the end. And that means, urging and encouraging governments of the countries where the Holocaust took place and where Jewish property was seized during the Nazi era, encouraging those governments to set up processes, mechanisms, pass laws that will provide for some measure of restitution or compensation for the various kinds of property that was seized. And that's not only private property like houses or apartments, but also communal religious property. So synagogues, cemeteries, school buildings sometimes, cultural centers, as well as kind of movable property, of which the most well-known is artwork. There have been a number of high-profile cases and movies about that. So that is one basket of issues that my office handles. We don't handle individual claims. We are working on a governmental, broad level to encourage and try to motivate countries to, as I said, do the right thing for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. The other basket of issues that I handle is Holocaust remembrance and commemoration and education. And that, of course, gets to many of the things that my colleague, Professor Kotler, just talked about. I've been in this position for about 6 months, and I'm really trying to focus us more on countering Holocaust distortion and denial, because as you've all said, that is, rising through people's use of social media. And particularly now during the pandemic, we are seeing these, horrendous false comparisons of some restrictions put in place because of the pandemic with, the suffering, the persecution that Jews suffered under during the Holocaust. We do that again on an international and kind of broad level, working with international organizations like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And I know my colleague Catherine Meyer from the IRA is here as well today. And working with colleagues all over the world and setting up international education and exchange programs. The United States runs exchange programs to bring over government officials and civil society experts to exchange, as you were saying, best practices, to train them on how to counter anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion. We also run teacher training programs in some countries about teaching the Holocaust, how to actually, teach accurately and truthfully and effectively about the Holocaust and the lessons we can draw from it. So with that, I'll stop.
If I could piggyback very briefly on your points, I think we can probably all agree that we've seen an increase in commemorations of various types over the years. I wonder how you would characterize the trajectory on material restitution. Is it in the same direction, or perhaps slowing down as there are fewer and fewer survivors amongst us?
I think naturally it is slowing down to some extent, first because many countries have completed their, as we like to say, their commitments under the Terezin Declaration, which was a non-binding agreement that 47 countries signed on to, saying they would make efforts to good faith, sincere efforts to address restitution in all its different methods. So yes, I mean, quite a lot of countries have done well in addressing those issues, done very well. Some countries still have a ways to go. And as you said, Holocaust survivors themselves are, inevitably diminishing in number, which makes it ever more urgent that we really address these issues now. But even as Holocaust survivors pass away, there are still survivors, there are still their descendants, and there are still Jewish communities, often very small Jewish communities, in the countries where the Holocaust took place. And they frequently need help to support maintaining synagogues, cemeteries, communal buildings, and to help, revitalize and re-energize communal Jewish life in those countries.
We can only imagine how difficult the pandemic period has been. Hard for all of us, but for Holocaust survivors, those whose families were largely decimated during the war, and those of a certain age, just how isolating and how difficult this period must have been and must still be for so many. So I'm sure your work is incredibly important to them, particularly at a time like this. Thank you for that. Well, we've heard from two national officials. Let's now shift briefly to regional representatives. Commissioner Fernando Lothenberg, your own position was created just a few months ago. And this may be some of our viewers' first opportunity to hear from you. I wonder if you could tell us about your responsibilities covering the 35, I believe, member states of the Organization of American States, in which, incidentally, B'nai B'rith itself has members, has been long been active with members across the hemisphere, and what you've been seeing, especially in Latin America.
Okay, thank you, David and Alina. I'd like to thank B'nai B'rith for inviting me to be here with my friends Katerina, Professor Kotler, now Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with you. So as you said, it's a brand new nomination. I started work last October, and the mandate that OAS and its Secretary General, Dr. Luis Almagro, structured is a few items, among which the structuration of a database of incidents in the region, court decisions, governmental policies, conceiving and designing measures to increase the level of knowledge of past and present manifestations of anti-Semitism, as well as the danger they pose to democracy in the region. So we are too much in the same line that Professor Kotler mentioned, though it's not an issue only of the Jewish community, but it's a threat to the whole society, and we should face it as a threat to democracy and to human rights. So we are stimulating member states and organizations to adopt the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism already adopted by OAS itself. And I should remember that especially the 33 countries of Latin America belong to a subcontinent formed under the influence of counter-reform. So we had here the Inquisition, either with tribunals or with visitations from the Inquisition for 300 years. That made traditional anti-Semitism very strong in the region, and it just started to wane and to be reformed in the religious sphere with the Vatican Concilium in 55 years ago. So we're still under that influence, and now we have, as in other countries, other forms of anti-Semitism, such as the one posed by the extreme left that is connected to the demonization and the legitimization of the state of Israel. And we had, especially during the last conflict between Israel and Hamas last May, episodes, the same that happened that you are familiar in New York, in LA. We also had in Sao Paulo and other cities of our continent. And we had, as we know, the third vortex of the anti-Semitism, which is Islamic fundamentalism, shown its presence in Latin America in the actions against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, 1992, and against AMIA, 1994. So it's a difficult task, but we are very animated with the last initiatives that happened in the region. So we have already Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil either as members or observers at the IRA. Other countries like Guatemala have adopted the working definition. Brazil has adopted the mandatory education on the Holocaust for its 9th grade, and other countries such as Mexico and Argentina are following through. And a bill already approved in the Brazilian Senate now is being debated in the House to combat fake news and hate speech. So as Professor Kotler mentioned, this is the territory where anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, Holocaust denial is being led, and the discussions and the preposterous posts that are being made are kindly unregulated. So in this Brazilian bill, the social networks are as a fertile ground to the actions of people and groups who try to manipulate public opinion. These organizations will be obliged to have headquarters in Brazil. They will have to have a transparency duty, observe due process in content moderation, establish a public code of conduct, and submit themselves to the law of the land where they do business, besides other duties. So I think we should focus on that issue because it happens all over the countries, and time is past for these social networks behave more responsibly, and either through self-regulation or through public regulation, we shall have new ways to make a civil and public acquaintance with a higher level of understanding and behavior. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And you know, your point about OAS leadership on adopting the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, we considered that principled position to be incredibly important, not only in our Western hemisphere, but really internationally. Hopefully we'll talk a little bit later with the executive secretary of IRA about the second important working definition of IRA on Holocaust denial and distortion, which was adopted in the UN General Assembly resolution this past week. But as B'nai B'rith and amongst our friends, both inside and outside the Jewish community, we think it's incredibly important that the working definition also of anti-Semitism be lifted up. And this is something that OAS has done very importantly. So thank you for that. I'd like to turn to, before turning to my colleague Alina, to European Commission Coordinator Katharina von Schnurbein. You've been a tremendous ally of the Jewish community and of B'nai B'rith across Europe, and really have made great strides in this critical European context over the last years. But we know that the challenges in Europe have continued to mount. Could you share with us some of the trends you've been observing in Europe over the course of your tenure with regard to Holocaust issues and how your position is designed to help address them?
Thank you, David and Alina, and thanks to B'nai B'rith for organizing this important exchange together with my esteemed colleagues to mark Holocaust Remembrance Day. I think it is really very important to continuously keep this tradition and uphold this tradition. Yeah, well, Holocaust denial, distortion, trivialization, unfortunately has increased also across Europe. We did a survey in 2019 where just over half of Europeans perceived Holocaust denial being a problem in their country, and 62 Jewish Europeans said that they have seen or heard non-Jewish people suggest that the Holocaust is a myth or that it is being exaggerated. So already then, that was before the pandemic, we had very high numbers. We also had a high awareness of it, I think, but now during the pandemic, as has been mentioned already, we've seen a very dangerous trivialization of the Holocaust, with the Stars of David being worn, saying non-vaccinated, with people making comparisons with victims of the Holocaust. And I think such trivialization is not only unacceptable, it is really, as Professor Kotler has already said, it is dangerous. It's dangerous for democracy, it's dangerous also for our societal cohesion and for our living together. So it distorts our historic memory and it distorts the facts. And so I think there are two issues with this. One is the lack of compass that we have seen, which to some extent comes from the lack of knowledge, lack of facts. And so I believe we need two aspects most importantly. And I think B'nai B'rith has really been very supportive and very much in the forefront in driving this. Political leadership on the one side. So as we have seen in the UN with the UN resolution on Holocaust denial last week, as we see with regards to IRA and the definition on Holocaust denial and distortion, as we see it also with lots of politicians on national level around Holocaust Remembrance Day, making statements and going public as to how important it is. We are joining this year for the first time the We Remembrance campaign with illuminating the headquarters of the European Commission to make a public statement and to join in also others like the Bundestag in Germany that will be illuminated, the National Council in Austria, the Town Hall in Brussels, and the European Parliament. So there are, I think this is important to go public, because in the end, what we need to do is to reach the general public. This is, of course, only the first step. Then it is about facts. There is a very good initiative by the IRA, which we have joined together with UNESCO, which is called Protect the Facts. It's a digital campaign which leads you to a website which gives you facts. So I think all of this is very important, and it can only happen if there is significant political leadership. And then on the other side, with regards to the facts, we have the whole wide range of education. This is curricula and traditional teaching, let's say, of facts, but it is also, I think, a wider knowledge, for example, about how local the Holocaust happened. I think we often forget. We talk about 6 million. Unless we give them names and we really look into their lives, they remain very abstract. And the European Commission, because we have seen this anti-Semitism on the rise and Holocaust distortion, we have adopted on the 5th of October of last year our first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. And as part of that, there is a pillar on Holocaust remembrance, which includes also Europe-wide initiatives to raise awareness about the facts of the Holocaust. One project, for example, is called Where the Holocaust Happened. So what we want to do together with local authorities, with schools, with local organizations, with civil society organizations, with people who have probably gathered some knowledge already about local places, like, for example, houses where Jews were hidden, or roundup places, even smaller killing sites that are not necessarily known very much in the immediate environment. We want to show how local it happened. And with this connected, of course, always also the question, what kind of choices did people make back then? What kind of choices do we have today when we see anti-Semitism on the rise? And as was said already, it was anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, but it didn't end there. So this is one important initiative that will happen and will be started and will be implemented in the next 10 years as this strategy is laid out for until 2030. We also want to create a larger debate in Europe about the future of remembrance. This society is changing. We are more diverse. We have less and less survivors with us, and still, hearing a testimony of a survivor is still always the most moving and the most effective, I think, way of imagining, at least getting a glimpse of what might have happened back then. But we will rely on different, we have to rely on different other forms in the future as less and less survivors are with us. So we can also use the digital sphere in a positive way. This is already being done with holograms and other initiatives. We want to create together with our representations that are in all EU member states, how to remember the Holocaust in diverse societies, also in countries, for example, where the Holocaust did not happen immediately. Yeah, so I think that it's an important aspect. We need to understand that we need to remember and understand the Holocaust whether it happened in our country or not. And therefore, it's very important to have also this, this larger approach to it.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and thank you for putting so much focus on this idea of bringing visibility and bringing the topic to a wider audience. We've spent a bit of time with each of you speaking about some of the challenges, distortion, trivialization, the challenges we face online, and of course, the dwindling numbers of survivors. Some of you already noted some of the solutions that you've put in place, and this is the direction where I'd like to focus the remaining 10 minutes or so of our conversation. Particularly focusing on 2 points on which some of you have already touched, the legal, more immediate remedies and the educational, more long-term remedies. So I would just ask each of you to weigh in on those that you have not yet had the chance to reflect on. Perhaps staying with you, Katerina, I think the EU is particularly relevant when looking at the legal framework. There is in place a common response to racism and xenophobia that covers as well Holocaust denial. Member states have to enact legislation, but this is not always necessarily the case, and implementation is rather limited. So how could we more effectively make use of these tools, and what is the EU strategy on anti-Semitism that you touched on before doing in this direction?
Yes, thank you, Alina. I'll be brief. So indeed, as you said, we have a legal framework that criminalizes Holocaust denial, trivialization, and condoning the Holocaust all across Europe. We have, so member states have the obligation to transpose those into national law. We have started so-called infringement procedures with those countries who have not done so yet, in order to ensure that this law becomes active in their national context. But as we know, any legal framework is only as good as its application. So what we really need is also a systematic prosecution of Holocaust denial and trivialization, whether it happens, and I think that is important nowadays, offline, of course. I think many people have a natural reaction to saying this needs to be prosecuted, but it is also the case for online. And this is the big challenge today. We need capacity building among law enforcement authorities. We need networks. We will build, as part of the strategy, also a network of trusted flaggers that can recognize, for example, a Holocaust trivialization, denial, and distortion. Distortion not necessarily being illegal, so more complicated, but still it needs a response, either from the platform or from prosecution, and also to support law enforcement authorities in the training of their agents with regards to recognizing Holocaust denial and distortion, and all the various forms of anti-Semitism as they are laid out in the IHRA definition. So it's these two aspects that need to go together: the prosecution on the one side, and the proper transposition of the legal framework on the other side, and then of course the knowledge about what the Holocaust, what Holocaust denial and distortion is, and there again a reference to the IHRA definition on Holocaust distortion, which can be very useful as a non-legally binding tool.
Thank you so much, Katerina. And now turning to Fernando Lotrenberg. Building on what Katerina von Schnurbein just described, could you give us a window into Latin America particularly, and the various approaches to Holocaust denial, distortion, trivialization, and any potential legal remedies that could be an inspiration there?
Sure. As Professor Kotler already mentioned, we have a very similar legislation and the court approach regarding anti-Semitism and incitation. There is a leading case in the Brazilian Supreme Court, which is known as the ØՂԻΓ case, which he was a publisher and he was a revisionist and a neo-Nazi, and he was charged with racism. And his defense was that as Jews are not a race, he could not be accused of racism. And he tried to defend himself like this. And when it arrived to the Supreme Court, it made a distinction between what is race, according to the genomics and all the recent conquests of the DNA investigation, etc., and decided that we are all human, we all belong to the same race, but you cannot use this as an argument to defend yourself saying you're not a racist. So this included anti-Semitism as a racist endeavor, and the Supreme Court says freedom of expression, and in Brazil and in Latin America, it's a very important value because we have been under military dictatorship, which has restricted freedom of expression for many years. So we don't want to we don't want to resign to that freedom that we conquered so hardly. But the Supreme Court decided that it has limits, and the freedom of expression does not protect the speech of anti-Semitism and incitation. Beyond that, there is legislation that prohibits the commercialization and exhibition of Nazi-era symbols in Brazil, and there are many lawsuits that deal with the case. So as Katerina said, it's important to have the legislation and it's important to make it effective. So not always the prosecutors and the judges understand or are sympathetic to their approach. So we produced here in Brazil, while I was president of the Jewish community, a guide to identify hate speech. So in order to help lawyers, police officers, prosecutors, and judges to identify that and to enforce the legislation against this kind of behavior. In the regional sphere, we have the Inter-American Convention, which is in the Article 4, prohibits this kind of behavior, the Democratic Charter of the OAS, and now we have a new Inter-American Convention against racism and discrimination that we have only 4 countries of the 35 who have already signed it, ratified, and deposited it, and we urge the other countries to adhere to it in order to become internal legislation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lautenberg. And perhaps coming with a last question to Ellen Germain, and perhaps a point of strongest contrast, moving to the United States, where freedom of speech is considered really sacrosanct and Holocaust denial is constitutionally protected free speech, as Professor Kotler noted at the start of the panel. Could you reflect on how you're addressing denial, distortion, trivialization, particularly when having fewer legal tools at your disposal? How are you sort of making up for this? And if I could ask you to give us your reply in 1 or 2 minutes.
Sure. Yes, as you say, the First Amendment to the Constitution broadly protects speech, including offensive speech, from government regulation. And as Professor Kotler said, there are some exceptions to that, but in general, the United States tradition is that the answer to offensive speech, including racist, anti-Semitic, Holocaust denying and distorting speech, is not government intervention or censorship, but more speech that promotes tolerance and counters lies with facts. But that's so that's definitely one piece of it. But of course, given the rise in people using social media platforms to spread misinformation, disinformation, there's a lot of debate about this in the US now. And at the moment in the United States, social media platforms are not liable for content that's posted by third-party users. So content that's posted by, the individual users is not regulated in any way by the government. And so there are a lot of questions now about whether, digital platforms should be responsible for the information that they post, or should they be responsible for the results of the algorithms that they use that sometimes end up inciting hatred or violence? And, should companies be regulated to limit the ability to do that? And there's no answer right now in the United States. Our government and our society is still trying to figure out how to deal with all of those thorny types of questions. And so, in the long run, education and educating about the Holocaust, educating about truth, educating for critical thinking so that people have the ability to distinguish between lies and truth is very important. It is also true that some platforms have voluntarily taken down some posts and have taken some action against Holocaust denial and distortion. Late 2020, Facebook agreed to take down posts that deny or distort the Holocaust and to direct users to, authoritative sources. And I tested that out myself, and I did get directed to authoritative sources when I was searching for things like Holocaust hoax. But it's very hard to find and to remove all the instances of Holocaust denial and distortion and other kinds of misinformation. So,
Ellen,
there are no easy answers.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have 10 more seconds.
Okay, I'll just say online platforms can also be a tool for spreading the truth, and we should acknowledge that as well.
Thank you so much. And I know that we could continue with this conversation for quite some time, but we see that that Secretary Mayorkas has entered the virtual room. So we're going to have to wrap up this part of our conversation now. But thank you all really for your insights today, for bringing into this conversation some best practices from your specific contexts. And most importantly, for the invaluable work that you do every day, you and your colleagues, to safeguard the memory of the Holocaust and tackle anti-Semitism. With that, we now turn the floor back over to Dan Mariashin to introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, David. And indeed, thank you to all of our first panelists for that rich conversation and so many interesting perspectives. I now have the privilege to introduce the United States Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, who is joining us live today. Secretary Mayorkas was born in Cuba to Jewish parents, his mother having fled from Romania during the Holocaust. The Mayorkas family later left Cuba for the United States. He is the first DHS secretary who is Latino, an immigrant, and a former refugee. And prior to his role as DHS secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas had a long record of government service, including tenure as U.S. Attorney, Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, and Deputy Director of DHS. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We're honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me today, and the honor is mine. When you walked into the home where I grew up, our living room shelves were filled with books of Jewish history and, regrettably, and all too often tragically, histories and stories of anti-Semitism and violence that accompanied it. My mother had lived this history. As a girl, she and her parents fled from Romania to France and on to Cuba because they could not make it safely to Israel or to the United States. Her father lost his parents, brothers, and other family members in the Holocaust. Through the years in the United States, my mother stayed in touch with her two cousins who survived the camps and had made it to Israel alone. Our home was deeply rooted in my mother's experience of the Holocaust and the fragility of our safety, wherever we might live in the world. As you might expect, my mother's childhood profoundly shaped her approach to a young child away from home through the night. When our fellow elementary school students went to sleepaway camps and had sleepovers with friends, my siblings and I did not. My mother taught us the meaning and experience of independence in different ways. She also taught us 3 foundational principles that defined for her the scourge of anti-Semitism and other ideologies of hate. First, their existence manifests itself in ways that we readily can see, but also lies more widely beneath the surface, often undetected in the day-to-day goings-on of life, but sometimes appearing in the most subtle of ways. Second, their prevalence continues to present an existential threat, and one can never assume that a Holocaust could not happen again and could not happen again where we, her children, might live. And third, that an attack born of hate against one minority is an attack against all of society. I am very proud to work in the Department of Homeland Security and battle alongside B'nai B'rith in the fight against hate and the fight to improve the quality of life for others. We cannot do it alone, but together we give limitless strength to our devotion to tolerance and basic human rights. We are doing a great deal to equip and empower communities across our country, and B'nai B'rith's companion reach spans the globe. Partnership in these efforts is all the more important today as the manifestations of hate through violence is on the rise everywhere. Holocaust Remembrance Day is recognized one day each year. We know that remembrance is every day, as is the work that must accompany it. Today, if you walk into the living room of the home where I was brought up and where my brother is now raising his young family, our mother's collection of books of Jewish history, including the anti-Semitism that defined too much of it, is still on the shelves. This year, as we devote a day of remembrance, let's redouble our efforts to create the book that captures the end of that hate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for your words, for your personal story, and for the continued commitment that you've expressed on behalf of the United States government to Holocaust remembrance, education, and the fight against all forms of anti-Semitism and extremism. We appreciate your being with us today.
Thank you.
Well, let us now go to the other side of the Atlantic for remarks by the Vice President of the European Commission, Margaritis Schinas. Margaritis Schinas is a former member of the European Parliament who has held various leadership roles within the Commission. As part of his responsibilities, he's currently tasked with leading the European Commission's efforts to combat anti-Semitism, as well as dialogue efforts with religious communities. In this role, he has been a trusted ally and partner of the Jewish community, and we appreciate very much his willingness to address this event. Please direct your attention to Vice President Schinas.
Dear friends, it is a great honor to join you today to remember those who perished in the Holocaust, to honor the survivors, and to reflect on how, by preserving the historic memory of this unfathomable tragedy, we can build better, more resilient societies free of hate. B'nai B'rith has been an important interlocutor for the European Union in our joint fight against anti-Semitism. And I wish to commend your efforts to honor and preserve the memory of the Shoah. and your advocacy for advancing Jewish and humanitarian causes across the world. Remembering the millions of Jewish men, women, and children, and the many other victims of the Nazi regime and their collaborators is our solemn duty. Anti-Semitism, which has been present in Europe for centuries, led to the Holocaust, but unfortunately did not end with it. Today, once again, this scourge is worryingly on the rise. Since the start of the pandemic, we have seen a spike in Holocaust denial and distortion. The virus of anti-Semitism has spiraled in the form of conspiracy myths and disinformation on social media, and also shockingly in the streets of many European cities during many anti-vax demonstrations. If left unchallenged, Holocaust distortion nourishes anti-Semitism, polarization, and dangerous form of nationalism. It constitutes a major and existential threat to our societies, and we should not take our democracies for granted. We need to protect our societies from any attempts to rewrite history and support open and independent research on all aspects of the Holocaust. At the same time, we must step up our efforts to fight anti-Semitism in all its forms, using the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as our starting point. Anti-Semitism is incompatible with Europe's core values, with human dignity and human rights, freedom, democracy, and equality, with all that which constitutes our European way of life. The first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, which I had the honor to present on behalf of the European Commission in October last year, constitutes, I believe, a turning point. It is testament to our commitment to ensure that Jewish life continues to thrive in Europe and beyond. Our strategy comprises 3 pillars: preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, protecting and fostering Jewish life in the EU, and education, research, and Holocaust remembrance. The EU also wants to lead the way globally, using all available tools to call on partner countries and international organizations to take action against anti-Semitism. Through our external cooperation, we will be financially supporting actions that combat anti-Semitism and that safeguard and revitalize Jewish heritage across the world. We will also work more closely with Israel, a key partner for us here in the European Union, including in the global fight against anti-Semitism. Dear friends, you pertinently chose to put in focus of today's discussion the importance of mainstreaming Holocaust remembrance across the whole of society, government, civil society, business, and cultural figures. We are facing major challenges now that the last Holocaust survivors are leaving us. We have entered a new digital era, and Europe is becoming more multi-ethnic and diverse. We therefore must find new ways of remembrance, and we are fully determined to do so. As outlined in our strategy, we will support the creation of a network of places where the Holocaust happened, such as hiding places, deportation points, and Jewish heritage sites all over Europe. Together with local communities, we want to allow citizens and visitors to retrace the centuries of Jewish presence throughout our continent, and to realize that the Holocaust is not the history of someone else. It is our history. We have made Holocaust remembrance a funding priority through our Citizens, Equality, Remembrance and Values program, setting a dedicated budget of €8 million for this year. In addition, we will support the creation of a European research hub on contemporary anti-Semitism to complement Holocaust research. And another crucial aspect is, of course, education, where our support will focus on training teachers and empowering them to address anti-Semitism and Holocaust in the classroom. We will continue to raise awareness amongst the wider population on countering distortion on the Holocaust through the #ProtectTheFacts campaign, and we are working on a broader awareness raising campaign to increase knowledge and understanding about Jewish life among the general public, always in close cooperation with Jewish communities. Reaching out to a younger generation of Europeans and taking advantage of this year, 2022, being designated as the European Year of Youth, we will set up a network of young ambassadors, young Europeans who will be called to promote Holocaust remembrance. And of course, we are stepping up action to address anti-Semitism online and fight anti-Semitic cyber hate. To that respect, we are cooperating closely with industry and IT companies so that we're able to enhance the role of trusted flaggers and fact-checkers, and also prevent the illegal display and sale of Nazi-related symbols, memorabilia, and literature online. Dear friends, these efforts combined have the potential to fundamentally transform mindsets and attitudes and bring us closer to a future free from anti-Semitism. But the success of all these initiatives will mainly depend on mobilizing all parts of our society. Combating anti-Semitism is a shared responsibility, one that requires action at every level of government. EU institutions, agencies, member states, our international partners, Jewish organizations and communities, human rights and civil society actors all have a role to play in achieving what we have traced in the strategy. Europe thrives in its diversity. Europe thrives when our Jewish communities also are able to thrive in it. This is a battle that we are determined to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Chinas, for those very important and detailed words about combating anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. I'd like to now return to our panel discussions and my colleague, Alina Brickman.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much, Dan, and indeed our thanks to Vice President Chinas. Turning to our second panel, I invite all our panelists to turn on their videos. Welcome, thank you for being with us. Vice President Chinas spoke of institutional responses, but to complement these responses, initiatives that engage civil society and the broader public are essential. With this second panel, we will now explore constructive approaches to safeguard the memory of the Holocaust in diverse fields, in sports, in the digital space, in interreligious spaces, and in the area of training of civil servants. Together with our distinguished speakers, we'll reflect on how each initiative has helped shape a culture of remembrance in their respective sectors. And I'll hand over to my colleague, David, to introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you again, Alina. And we really are very fortunate to be joined by our next guests. We've invited each of these prominent experts to focus especially on one key area of their work with the aim, as Alina mentioned, of showcasing best practices in remembrance and education across different fields, recognizing that preserving the memory of the Holocaust is a responsibility for all of society. It's an honor with us. It's an honor to have with us today Katrin Meyer, who already has been mentioned, Executive Secretary of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, Tracy Peterson, who is manager of the United Nations Outreach Program on the Holocaust, Daniel Loische, who is head of corporate responsibility at the German football club Borussia Dortmund, and Tibi Galic, who is executive director of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide, as well as Omar Al-Busaidi, who is the USA CEO of the Sharaka Initiative. Thank you all again for being here. Katrin Meyer, starting with you. IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, really is the only intergovernmental body of its kind, with participating countries coming together specifically around Holocaust-related matters, as well as combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. For those who may be unfamiliar with the organization, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about IHRA's mandate and the way it works, as well as some of the main challenges that you confront. And since we mentioned it earlier during our first panel, I wonder if you could speak to any way in which the UN General Assembly resolution on Holocaust denial and distortion adopted last week might relate to IHRA and your work.
Thank you very much, David, for your kind words of introduction. Yeah, I have the feeling you did not really need to invite me because everybody knows about our work. Our work is quoted by everybody, so I'm very pleased about that. But of course, I'm happy to say a few words about the IHRA before I come to our mandate and talk about challenges. So the IHRA came into being a little bit before the year 2000 of the Stockholm Forum, which took place in the year 2000, January 2000. We now have 35 member countries. And we have, as you mentioned, a unique mandate. We're the only intergovernmental body that is exclusively devoted to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, to analyze phenomena that led to the Holocaust, to combat anti-Semitism, to combat hatred against Roma. And of course, one of our main tasks right now is combating and addressing Holocaust denial and distortion. And mainly it is distortion, but I come to this later. But what makes us unique is not only our very focused and unique mandate, it is also the fact that we bring together governmental representatives and experts. And we have experts, of course, in our working groups and committees from all 35 member countries. That means we have what I like to call an army. We have an army of experts and the world leading experts in these fields that we're active in. And they make recommendations, they develop tools, and they are there as advisors to our political level. So all the tools we have developed over the past, or more than 2 decades were initiated by our expert community within the IHRA, and are also a result of the international collaboration and this international network that was formed. Because I think what's important is also the network idea, sharing best practices, talking about challenges. Nobody's in this alone. Holocaust denial and distortion, anti-Semitism, the neglect of the research on the Holocaust is something that we saw everywhere. And I think IHRA was also up for overcoming that. We have identified Holocaust distortion, a priority issue 5 years ago. So in 2017, the IHRA decided to focus on in their strategy on safeguarding the record and addressing Holocaust distortion. That was at a time when we already had agreed on the definition on Holocaust denial and distortion, but there was little to no international and definitely no political recognition of this issue. So what we are facing now, and on one hand, it's a good thing, and on the other hand, it shows how serious the situation is, because we have picked that up, as I said, 5 years ago when nobody was interested in this topic. And Holocaust distortion is often seen a little bit like the little brother of Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is being seen, yeah, that's an issue. If, you know, if the Holocaust is straight out denied, that's an issue. But Holocaust distortion, those are opinions, you know, that's not really a problem. We said, no, it is a huge problem. It is a huge problem. And as some of the speakers already mentioned, it's a stepping stone for anti-Semitism. It is a stepping stone to denial. And I think since the COVID-19 pandemic started and we see all these false facts being spread and the Holocaust being compared to situations now that are absolutely illegitimate, shows that Holocaust distortion is a threat to our democracies. It is a threat to the memory of the Holocaust. And this is extremely, extremely dangerous. Holocaust distortion, and that is what we have seen and identified as one of the main problems, it desensitizes people to anti-Semitism effects. If you talk about the Holocaust as if you can have different opinions about it, if you say, you know, you can have this opinion or that opinion, of course it happened, but you know, these details could be tweaked, or those details could be tweaked, or again, comparisons are being made that are outrageous. It desensitizes people. It desensitizes people to the facts. And it is, and I think this is important also, it's a disgrace towards the victims and the survivors. And I think this is also one very important aspect of the IRA I would like to mention here in my first intervention, and that is that the governments that started the IRA and the governmental representatives that devoted and committed themselves and their governments to the work of the IRA are convinced that it is to remember the Holocaust and to fight anti-Semitism is a responsibility of humankind. It's not just the responsibility of Jewish communities. So this is also something I think that the IRA contributed a great deal to this awareness raising. It is an overall responsibility for all organizations, for all societal actors, and definitely for the governments to remember the Holocaust, to honor the victims.
Well, thank you very much. You know, we might have hoped after prominent episodes like the legal battle between David Irving and Deborah Lipstadt not too many years ago, that some of these phenomena may have been put a bit more into check. But unfortunately, even here in the US, we've seen public figures on a number of occasions recently, local legislators, educators who have spoken of neutrality or even-handedness in teaching the history of the Holocaust. These are shocking episodes that unfortunately continue to come up. So thank you very much, Dr. Meyer, and I apologize if I misspoke earlier. Of course, your role is Secretary General of the IRA. I'd like to move on to Tracy Peterson, whose office has been yet another very important partner of B'nai B'rith. Tracy, I wonder if you could tell us about the evolution and the scope of your role and how it fits into the broader UN system. We know that within the UN, notwithstanding all of the challenges that many in the Jewish community associate with the body, UNESCO, the High Representative of the Alliance of Civilizations' new focal point on anti-Semitism, Miguel Moratinos, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid, all of these and others have done some relevant work on Holocaust memory and combating anti-Semitism. So can you give us a better sense of what the Holocaust and the United Nations outreach program, which you lead, does to practically advance Holocaust remembrance and education globally? And if I could repeat my question to Katrin Meyer, how might the new General Assembly resolution just adopted on Holocaust denial affect your own work?
Thank you very much, David. And it really is my honor and pleasure to be able to join today's discussion, to be able to share with you and everyone listening more about the work that the United Nations does and its commitment to Holocaust commemoration and education. And so I thought I would begin just really talking very briefly about what the Holocaust has to do with the United Nations, and then specifically about the program. And of course, I will address the question about the most recent resolution. So let's jump in there, if that's all right. So as we know, the United Nations was established in response to the horror of the Second World War and of course the Holocaust. And every day since 1945, the United Nations and its agencies put into action the pledge to never forget. We will never forget our responsibility to build together as a multinational organization, a world in which all can live with dignity and in peace. And just most recently, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres observed that the Holocaust reverberates through the United Nations. It's evident in the founding documents of the organization, in its commitment to multinational action to prevent future genocides, to protect future generations from the scourge of war. And of course, it can also be seen in the priorities and actions of United Nations agencies and bodies to address the factors that actually facilitate genocide, to fight poverty, inequity and inequality, racism and war. And so the organization's aim to achieve a sustainable peace, an aim which the member states all agree to achieve a sustainable peace where all can live with dignity and thrive, is itself an expression of the reaction to the horrors of the Holocaust. The significance of the Holocaust to the United Nations is evident in the outreach activities organized by the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program and the network of United Nations information centers whose outreach we support. And of course, this global network of information centers plays an invaluable role in Holocaust commemoration and education. And you have already mentioned the United Nations Specialized Agency, UNESCO, specifically its education division, which supports and is supported by our program. And so there's very close cooperation across the United Nations to bring to the attention the importance of not forgetting the history of the Holocaust. Likewise, to support and develop a deeper understanding of the history as one way, of course not the only way, to begin to counter the insidious and really dangerous existence of Holocaust distortion and denial. So in 2005, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed by consensus Resolution 67, which designated the 27th of January as an annual International Day of Commemoration. And the date was chosen specifically to mark the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by Soviet armed forces in 1945. The same resolution rejected Holocaust denial and condemned, and I quote, "without reserve, all manifestations of religious intolerance, incitement, harassment, or violence against persons of communities based on ethnic origin or religious belief wherever they occur." And the same resolution in 2005 established the outreach program and mandated the program to mobilize civil society for Holocaust remembrance and education in order to help to prevent future acts of genocide. We are overseen by the Education Outreach Section, and that's located in the Department of Global Communications. And in the last 17 years, we've developed a multifaceted program with educational materials. We've translated them into official languages of the United Nations wherever possible. And we've developed worldwide partnerships. And, you know, against, as our speakers have mentioned, this global context of rising anti-Semitism and the increasing levels of disinformation and hate speech, Holocaust education and remembrance is even more urgent, as is the development of an historical literacy to counter repeats attempts to deny and distort the history of the Holocaust. So just very quickly to say, in the last 2 years, we have moved all our programming online, and this has in fact expanded our reach We have involved and been, speakers from around the world in ways that we would not have been able to before. And more importantly for me, also, we've been able to reach people in a direct way that we were not able to do. Our audience, if you like, is civil society and beyond. And so our programs reflect this as well, that we are, in some instances, we have partnered, for example, with legal organizations or medical institutions to talk about, again, what is the relevance of the history of the Holocaust to thinking about contemporary issues of ethics and values. We work very closely with our outreach program on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and the Office for the Prevention of Genocide, so that we can build networks of solidarity across communities, because the history of the Holocaust, like all histories, is specific. No history is identical. And part of our mandate is to make sure that people understand the historical specificity and that we are protecting the historical integrity. And at the same time, to talk about the reverberations of this history across time, across countries, that is affected in the way our world. We also take very seriously the mandate to make sure that the voices of survivors are heard. And so we've looked at new media ways of trying to advance that. And we've developed, for example, a podcast with our survivors' testimonies on that. We take our partnerships very, very important and very seriously. And so we've partnered, as I've already mentioned, UNESCO. We have a partnership with the World Jewish Congress, the Oxford Internet Institute of Oxford University, for example, where we are, first of all, have conducted an online research study into Holocaust distortion. We're looking at developing a teacher's guide based on that research. We're also working with the UNESCO International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, where we are developing a guide for teachers in the African region on educating about atrocity crime, including the Holocaust. We too, like the European Commission and UNESCO, partner and IRA on the social media campaign against Holocaust distortion. And so we have a number of very important partnerships that we have. I want to just very quickly touch, I'm aware of the time, on your question about the most recent resolution, and also just to pick up on something that Katrina said. The United Nations has always been deeply concerned about Holocaust distortion and denial. And in fact, resolutions subsequent to 2005 have targeted exactly these issues. And of course, we are greatly pleased by the resolution. And what these resolutions do is that, of course, they are statements, global statements, acknowledging the grave danger that Holocaust distortion poses all of us. And so for us, it's a very important development, and it will certainly, encourage us to continue working. If there is time, I will expand a little on the relationship we have with our information centers, because it's very important in terms of talking about the Holocaust history to think about the local context in which that history is being heard. And I will wait for an opportunity to share that with you. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, and thank you and your colleagues for all of your work and your accessibility to us and your partnership throughout the year, but especially during this week, which really is high season at your office. We know we don't take for granted the time you've taken, and we appreciate your being with us. I'd like to turn briefly to Professor Galich. The Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide does great work in cooperating with a wide range of stakeholders to educate about genocide, often starting with the Holocaust as a point of reference, although I'm sure, as Tracy Peterson just noted, without blurring the distinctions between each of these tragic but unique events. Tell us about the Institute's approach, if you would, and your areas of work, and then perhaps in a second round, we can narrow in on your engagement with policymakers more specifically.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. We are very honored to partner with our great hosts and to bring to you some information about our work in the context of today's remembrance. Holocaust Memorial Day is a very important date for the Auschwitz Institute because, as the name might give it away, we were created to honor the memory of the victims of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, to make sure that nobody around the world experiences their fate, being victimized and being killed because of their identity. So our mission is to build a world that prevents atrocities, mass atrocities, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes everywhere in the world, protecting every individual's identity and making sure that they don't experience marginalization. We do so through education, training, and technical assistance. We support states mainly to develop or strengthen policies and practices for the prevention of genocide and other mass atrocities. We also encourage and support the cooperation of states through regional and international networks that advance prevention. To give you a bit of a sense of how does this really work, we are an international NGO that was created in 2006 with the goal to initially collect knowledge about how does one prevent atrocities. And as you said, David, this transfer of knowledge, mainly to government officials, starts with talking about the past, and very often talking about the history of the Holocaust and learning lessons that are relevant for understanding our context today, for preventing crimes that have at the center the Jewish community, but also have at the center any other identity groups around the world. We have grown since our 2006 creation to partner with 91 governments around the world, training their training officials. Currently, our training programs have more than 13,500 alumni across the world that have engaged with our materials that really draw on the experiences of the past to equip government officials with new challenges related to protecting identity groups from identity-based crimes. Unfortunately, the creativity of possible perpetrators is never ending, and new tools are coming to assist their efforts. And consequently, the challenges that government structures that face limited resources and limited capacity are also higher. So we see it as our mission to step up to this challenge and to equip our partners with the tools that give them the possibility to set up strategies, set up legal system, but also go beyond what unfortunately very often is the realm of prevention, seen simply legal frameworks, go beyond that and genuinely make the spirit and the letter of the law a reality, and to prevent atrocities, prevent marginalization on a daily basis through their work as government officials. We have offices currently in Oświęcim in Poland, in New York City in the US, and we also have regional offices working in Buenos Aires, in Kampala, and in Bucharest. That also gives you quite a good sense probably of the regions that we mostly work in. We also currently run extensive programming beyond Latin America, North America, Europe, East Africa, and a special focus of Southeastern Europe. We also run programming in Southeast Asia through local partners. So this is, I guess, a bit of a sense of the work we do. I would like to mention, before I pass the word back to you, David, that it is essential for our work to understand atrocities as processes, and as social processes where there are plenty of opportunities to intervene and to avoid the worst from happening. We also have learned through research and practice that one of the tools that serves best society's capacities to put in place preventive measures is their ability to deal with their own past of atrocity. That is why memorialization remembrance transitional justice processes are essential for prevention and for combating in our everydays the scourges of marginalization and victimization. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Professor Galic. And we have lots of questions. I hope we'll have some more time for follow-up. For now, Daniel Loisha, the institution that you represent as a football, here we might say soccer club, is an unexpected one for some when thinking of Holocaust education, but I think even those of us who are not yet familiar with the work that you do, I think we can all take for granted that you have quite an important ability to reach audiences that other institutions very well might not. So can you tell us a bit about why and how Borussia Dortmund chose to prioritize Holocaust education and the fight against anti-Semitism? And how do you measure the impact that your initiative has been having?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the possibility to share our work here. I think it really started as a reaction to a problem that we have had in the back in the past. We have had different incidents, threats in the city of Dortmund, but also in the stadium, and it was always connected to each other. So there was not a starting point in football or a starting point in the city. It was just the problem was there, and we need to face it. And more than 10 years ago, we decided to start to empower the positive force and create a positive network of supporters and see our supporters as a solution and not as a problem in this field. And so we established a huge program that we are running now. It's under the umbrella of United by Borussia. That's the name of it. And in this special topic, it's United by Borussia, United in Remembrance, United Against Anti-Semitism. And you could even buy a scarf in our merchandising stores with the sentences on it. So the idea is really to use our audience and to use the wide outreach that we have to address these topics and to educate people and bring the people together in different programs, and also on the other hand to establish networks with different network partners in sports, of course, and I think it's important to name, for example, Chelsea from London here at this point, because they are running a huge program as well, but also beyond sports. When it comes to the Museum Auschwitz, the youth meeting center there, or Yad Vashem, for example, we have supported the establishment of the Shoah Heritage Collection Center in Yad Vashem. So it's really important to have the network in sports, but also beyond. And what we are doing is we are addressing our supporters, and in the last year we also added employees and sponsors and partners, and we have a huge program. And in the program, we are organizing several multiple-day educational tours to Auschwitz, but also to the not so well-known places like in the Lublin region. And we have lectures, we have workshops on current anti-Semitism, and we are doing exhibitions or other educational programs. And the idea is always bring together supporters from different groups, like in different age groups, with different financial and educational backgrounds. And I also want to add that we have had an EU-funded project, Changing the Chance. And within this project, we have created guidelines and a compendium about best practices in European soccer. Let's name it soccer here, it's quite easier than football. And within this project, especially the guidelines, the idea was to create guidelines to combat anti-Semitism in soccer and to bring people in the position to do the first steps, but also then, if they have done them, to go further. And I think that's maybe the idea of an overview. And I just forgot to answer the question about the how we measure our actions or how our program. I think the most important thing is that when we started back in 2011, we haven't had an anti-discriminatory fan initiative. So like there was no fan network taking action, and especially now due to COVID, but before COVID, we have had a huge group of supporters who has produced banners in the stadium or other activities, and so we see a huge interest in our work. We see a huge impact on the stands, and there was really a climate change in the stadium, better feeling, and yeah, everybody feel welcome, which is quite different than 10-15 years ago.
Thank you very much, and even for those of us here on the other side of the pond who aren't particularly familiar with European sport, unfortunately, we and above all, the survivors of the Holocaust have been subjected to really a steady trickle of stories, especially from Europe, perhaps not only Europe, of anti-Semitic expressions and racist expressions in sport. I'm off the top of my head, just over the recent period, stories from the UK, from Central and Eastern Europe, from Belgium, chants about Hamas and Jews to the gas, really atrocious stuff that would be shocking and deplorable in any setting, and I think is especially jarring in the safe space that we would all hope sport to be for the broad spectrum of members of society, and especially for young people who take sports so seriously. So thank you for the important work that you do. Looking at the clock, we come to Omar Al-Basaidi, who is not least important in our lineup today. Omar, recent years have seen some remarkable progress in relations between Arabs and Israelis and Arabs and Jews in the Middle East and beyond. And while clearly there's still so much more to do, among the very hopeful developments is the broadening of exposure to the history of the Holocaust, the sensitizing of new audiences to that genocide and to the history of persecution, of ignorance and intolerance that predated it, where previously all of this or much of this was taboo or worse in some societies. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your story, about the Sharaka initiative, and about the work you're doing to facilitate opportunities for young people to overcome stereotypes through learning about one another directly.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor. I want to first say Assalamu alaikum or Shalom alaikum to everyone here. One of the things that a lot of people do not know is that there was already a quite significant number of Jews living in the UAE, but the Jewish community was kind of not really out there. But after the signing of the Abraham Accords, a lot of them came out. You know, now you walk around the streets in the UAE, you see everybody wearing the kippah. Now, myself, when I was in the US, I was actually there through the Fulbright program doing my master's in international affairs. What happened is Sharaka reached out to me because I was very happy when the Abraham Accords was signed, and I was being interviewed by different news outlets in the US and the UAE about my feelings towards the Abraham Accords. So then Sharaka said, would you like to represent us in the US? So Sharaka, just to give you some context, it means partnership in Arabic. And this was set up right after the signing of the Abraham Accords between an Israeli and an Emirati to try to accelerate the people-to-people engagement. You know, what we did not want to see is something of what happened when you know, Israel signed the peace agreement with Egypt and with Jordan. Although this was not a peace agreement with the UAE, we were never in conflict, but this formalization of relationship between the two countries, we wanted the people to sort of like engage very quickly. So what Sharaka did is, it is the first organization that took a delegation from the UAE, which had people from different nationalities, including Emiratis, Indians, the different nationalities that live in the UAE. And they went to Israel, and they also went to the Yad Vashem. And it's really unfortunate that I don't have Dr. Majid As-Sarrah, who's the CEO of Sharaka UAE, who was actually there, and he was able to experience and even express what he felt when he learned about what happened there. It was tragic, and what he did by going there, and everybody else that was on that delegation. We even had a Bahraini woman that went there as well, Fatma Al-Harbi. They were able to take that experience and come back to their respective countries and to speak and to people, get interviewed by different news outlets, and to share the message and about the importance of the constant awareness of what happened to during the Holocaust. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't know as well is last year, we in the UAE, we have the first Holocaust memorial exhibition that is set up at the place here called the Crossroads of Civilizations. It's in the old historic area in Dubai. I was actually there at the opening of this event with the German ambassador, Peter Fischer, Itan Nae, the former Israeli ambassador to the UAE, who's now the ambassador to Bahrain. And so this is part of something that the UAE is working on doing. We also had recently the US Holocaust Museum delegation that came for the first time to visit the leadership here in the UAE, and there was a lot of discussion, including with the Ministry of Education in the UAE, and I think there's going to be some plans about trying to communicate this message. There's also a very prominent think tank in the UAE called Trends that also was had a discussion recently about anti-Semitism and about the Holocaust as well. So what Sharaka is trying to do is we are trying to communicate this message to not only the countries that are that have signed the Abraham Accords, but one of the reasons why I myself am in the US is because unfortunately the media in the US does not cover the work that is taking place and this new narrative that is happening in the Middle East. And this is why we're working with different partners, and we appreciate the work that you're doing and that the fact that you invited us, because a lot of people don't know about us and they haven't heard because you don't see that on mainstream media. So my role in the US is to do exactly that, to meet different communities, Jewish, non-Jewish communities, Muslim communities, Christian communities, everybody, and to translate what's happening on the ground. It's definitely changing the number of people who are looking to volunteer with Sharaka to attend our events. We just organized the Tu Bishvat event as well. We had Lag BaOmer, we had all these different Jewish festivals and also Muslim festivals side by side, and the Jewish community continues to grow. I always tell people we already have like 7 chief rabbis in the UAE, which is quite significant, and so this, and of course they all communicate the message of coexistence, peace, and also raising the awareness of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and everything else that is a problem for the different communities around the world. So this is very quickly a brief about what Sharaka is doing and what we're doing to work with our cousins, the Jewish community.
Well, thank you so much for that, Omar. And we at B'nai B'rith take tremendous pride in the deep and deepening relationships that we've had at all levels with Emiratis and with leaders and people in some of your neighboring countries. But the work that you're doing, I think, is important, not only in terms of Holocaust memory and tackling all forms of intolerance, but really in lots of other ways. The ripple effects truly are positive and great. And I believe we have the chairman of Yad Vashem on right now, who will be joining in a few minutes. So I'm sure that Dani Dayan takes real satisfaction from the success of that visit, and we hope to hear from him as well. So thank you, Omar. Alina, why don't you jump in here?
Yes, thank you, David. So I'd love to focus more specifically on some of the projects that you're working on. You've already touched a little bit upon them, and now is the chance to go a little bit deeper. Katrin Meyer, coming to you, you mentioned precisely the fact that a lot of other panelists are noting your work, are noting the Protect the Facts campaign, and that's precisely what I'd love to go a little bit deeper into together with you. This is a campaign that you are currently running together with partners, a campaign that also Vice President Shinas mentioned. Of course, the digital sphere has been increasingly difficult. Distortion and trivialization tend to find sort of infinite fertile ground. online. Social media companies have often accelerated the issue rather than helped solve it. So how has IRA generally reacted to this increasing challenge online? And in telling us about the campaign, how has Protect the Facts helped address some of these online ills?
Thank you, Alina, for this question. Allow me to come back to the question that David has also asked earlier about the just passed resolution in the United Nations. That is, of course, extremely meaningful for us. As I said earlier, and David also mentioned it, we have this very narrow, very, very exclusive focus and mandate. And when the big international partners, the big international organizations, intergovernmental international organizations pass resolutions or adopt programs that are so directly related to our mandate, of course, it strengthens our work and definitely our partnership. And that brings me to the Protect the Facts campaign that you were asking about. So the Protect the Facts campaign is the first global joint awareness raising campaign on social media to focus on recognizing and countering Holocaust distortion. And we are together 4 very strong partners. It's the IRA together with the European Commission, United Nations, and UNESCO. So we launched it on International Holocaust Remembrance Day a year ago. And we have had an unparalleled global reach with this campaign. Also allow me to say that we had no problem with trolls, with online trolls when we started this campaign. We were prepared for that, but it didn't really happen. And it shows also it's worth engaging online and that we must outnumber those who spread the hate. What we need to do, and I think I'm proud to say that I think we managed to do that, it needs to be cool. It needs to be cool. The campaign as such needs to be cool, but we need to create an atmosphere that it is cool to be against anti-Semitism and to stand up against anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. We have an excellent and very dynamic design. The visuals reflect the concept that we are trying to explain. We have high quality content and it's multilingual. So, and of course we had the advantage of very prominent partners promoting it, like the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, UNESCO Director Audrey Azoulay, UN Goodwill Ambassadors. We reached more than 15 million people for the campaign launch in 2021. And people from almost every country in the world have engaged with this campaign. So it shows hatred is taking place online, but we can also counter it online. So the online world is part of the solution here. So what we have done with this campaign, as we actually do with all our tools, whether it's the different definitions that were mentioned earlier, or whether it is this campaign, or I can also mention later a couple of other very practical tools we have developed, we raise awareness. We raise awareness about the issues that are often in the shadows of the societies. We increase international cooperation and we inspire action. And I think what is also important, and this is also something that I would like to relate to with regard to what Daniel Lörcher has said earlier about, the activities in football or on soccer. I think what our tools do, and what also the Protect the Facts campaign does, is it empowers non-experts. You don't have to be an expert to go online and join Protect the Facts. You can, you have to have an internet access. That's pretty much it. And that means if non-experts feel empowered and encouraged to join the good fight, we will have an effect. And we have seen that here. So this is also a shift for us, because we used to be an organization exclusively working with the governmental and expert representatives of our national delegations. But we now go wide outside of the IRA. Our audiences are way beyond the IRA delegations. I mean, we see it in the world of football, where Chelsea was the first club who adopted the working definition on anti-Semitism. We work very closely with them and with other clubs, of course. For example, this year, we're also doing a campaign with Chelsea together, Why We Remember, encouraging people to upload short videos, why we remember the Holocaust. So again, something that happens online, as well as protect the facts. And I think this is where we reach mainstream society, where we reach important multipliers, such as young people who might not be so interested in some of the books and the guidelines that are out on the Holocaust or Holocaust distortion, but the social media campaigns really show a big success here.
Alina, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that. Wonderful, and I loved your note about the fact that we have to make it cool to be against anti-Semitism. And I think that also goes well hand in hand with the target audiences that you've described, reaching a younger generation and so on. I would love to invite everyone who is on with us today to take a moment after our program and check out the campaign. And more importantly, perhaps be part of disseminating it. And you can find all the necessary information at againstholocaustdistortion.org. We'll share the link in the chat as well, so keep an eye out there. Let me turn now to Tracy Peterson. You mentioned the United Nations Information Centers earlier on. So we'd love to hear about them and what they are, what they are doing, but especially what is their impact.
Thanks, Alina. I'm reminded again of something that the Secretary General said in the last, I think on Friday, the importance to remember that with solidarity, we can push back against the damage that we are doing in terms of Holocaust distortion and denial. And I'm just struck again by listening to everyone that this is precisely why it's so important. And I thank B'nai B'rith for bringing us all together, for us to be reminded that there is this network of organizations and institutions and initiatives working towards the same goal. So to your question, the United Nations Information Centers, or UNICs, exist around the world. There are 63 across different regions. And their task is really to, within the local context, inform people about the work of the United Nations, because the United Nations, as much as it is made up of member states, it's also really, it belongs to the peoples of the world. Now, the information centers will traditionally, for example, focus activities, outreach activities, looking at the international days that are on the calendar, and in that way communicate the goals and the values of the United Nations. They have access to local context. They have developed partnerships with local institutions, players, and they really understand the sensitivities and the specificities of that area in which they're based. And so you can understand why they are invaluable in terms of our outreach. They are best placed to understand what educational products will be accessible and which will work, if you like, be more effective than others. And so I want to, and they do remarkable work. I mean, I'm just in awe of our colleagues in the field. I want to share one example. In Zambia, our colleagues in Zambia, we had an exhibition, 2 exhibitions, which they have taken, and they have, we adapt them into portable formats. Our information centers, by the way, I'm not speaking about Zambia now, because Zambia's languages that the exhibition is shown is in English, but our information centers have also been responsible for helping us with translation of resources into Kiswahili, for example, Azeri, for example. And so one of our partners is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they developed, together with us, they adapted one of their exhibitions about propaganda as the state of deception and the power of Nazi propaganda. And we had translated and we sent to the field. Now, what Zambia did was that they took these posters, they organized with local schools, they have toured with these posters, taking them to, in some instances, quite remote areas. And at the same time, organizing briefings with teachers and working with students. So there's something very powerful about that, because, unlike parts of the world where the theater of war played itself out, there is not an immediate, and understandably, an immediate connection to this history and why it would be important. And I think the information centers play I know they play a really important bridge in contextualizing and helping people understand that why Holocaust remembrance matters.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And as we speak about bringing education about the Holocaust around the world, perhaps, Omar, I can come back to you. You spoke a little bit about your delegation to Yad Vashem. Could you speak a little bit to the impact that you saw that visit having, the conversations that you may have heard about that visit, the very tangible impact that you could feel the visit had? And to what extent do you envision similar programs you might be running in the future? And especially if there's anything concrete coming up, do feel free to share about that with us.
Thanks, Alina. So just to be clear, I actually haven't been there myself, but Majid, the CEO of Sharaka UAE, has been, and I'm looking forward to going to Israel in April to Dan's bar mitzvah, his son's bar mitzvah. So I'm going to be going there very soon, and definitely I'm going to visit the Yad Vashem. But according to Majid, I mean, for him, this was something that was a truly eye-opening experience. And I'll explain something to you. In the UAE, and especially here in the Gulf, but let me just speak about the UAE since I'm from the UAE. In the UAE, we haven't had anything that was anti-Semitic, or there wasn't anything that was, anything to do with Holocaust denial. We've had, movies about the Holocaust that was always in the cinema. These things were always shown, but we never had anything in our textbooks or anything like that. However, we never had education, like a deeper education about what exactly took place and what has happened. So the experience of Dr. Majid and others, it kind of opened a whole new discussion and a time for us to even understand the Jewish people even deeper, and for us to be able, in our own native language, in our own native dialect, to explain that to the communities here through outreach events and through the media, etc. So this is what Majid and the other team that were able to sort of translate that message here in the UAE. So as I said, for me personally, the one, because I told you I haven't been to the Yad Vashem, but I was at the opening of the Holocaust Memorial exhibition here in Dubai. It was, and meeting people who, have relatives that had escaped the Holocaust or who suffered the unfortunate consequences of it. It was, we now have more sympathy, even more than what we have just heard or seen before through different material. So one of the things that I think from now on is definitely the UAE is working constantly on evolving and developing our education material. And I think very soon that this information will go further down, as was expressed earlier, try to make the information cool or more sort of delivered in a way where the youth will understand it better and hopefully never again. And one of the things that's really important to highlight is after the Abraham Accords was signed, the UAE foreign minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan visited. He'd been to the Holocaust Memorial there in Germany, and he also signed there never again, and that was something that went viral. So when he did that, that was also very impactful. Because one of the things you have to understand is, especially here in the Gulf and in the UAE, the relationship between the leadership and the people is very, very strong. It's almost like you can say it's like paternal. Our leadership is like, we look at them like they're our parents. So whatever they do and whatever they experience, it's one of those things that I think even for us, when we go and travel, it's not just going to the tourist spots and everything, but we will go and visit these different sites to understand to understand history and what happened exactly.
Thank you very much, Omar. And I think it's really fascinating to see these first-time encounters between people and the topic of the Holocaust. So it's extremely important that you're providing an opportunity for that. Tibi Galish, coming to you, you spoke about the incredible work you're doing with government officials. You mentioned working with 91 governments, 13,000 alumni. That is really incredible reach. And I'd love to hear about the very concrete impact that you're seeing from these trainings. We're quite tight on time, so if I can ask you to keep that in mind.
Yes, Alina, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about impact. Maybe I'll just give you a few parameters for what do people walk away after training. They walk away, of course, with the knowledge about the Holocaust and knowledge about mass atrocities happening in their region. And they have the tools as government officials to engage with denial, with trivialization, with distortion related to these traumatic events from our history, from each country's history. At the same time, they walk away with the capacity to assess risk within any society. So that is important both for seeing where governmental intervention is necessary for domestic action to reduce marginalization at home, and two, it's relevant for foreign policy efforts to see where the resources of a state through its own foreign policy and through its development policy can assist populations that are in danger of being victimized and experience increased rates of marginalization. And then they walk away with the capacity to develop policy. They learn about policy models, what colleagues of theirs in years before have done to engage with these problems. And, the usual suspects, reforming legal frameworks, but then the hard work of how actually tracking risks and tracking how risks are being reduced. What type of educational policy is relevant? What type of redistributive policy is relevant? What type of new memorialization, new transitional justice programs? What truth commissions are necessary to assist the community that's been victimized in the past so that they can enjoy the resources that society enjoys at large? Lots of types of policies, and just in the last 3 years, we've been trying to track what our alumni have done in terms of initiating policy work. And as far as we know, and we are very happy with this, our alumni have contributed to governmental spending of more than $295 million in new atrocity prevention policies that have been developed based on the knowledge that has come out of the courses and the technical assistance programs that we provide. I would be very happy to give a lot more information to everyone. I know you don't have time, but don't hesitate to reach out to us at auschwitzinstitute.org, and we'll be very happy to be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tibi, also for keeping it short. And I was going to do the website plug myself, so thank you very much for doing it on your side. Moving now to Daniel. I'd love to zero in on the Football Players in Focus project. I loved what you said earlier about looking at supporters as solutions rather than problems. And I think this is particularly a project where you're looking at supporters as an entry point, in a sense, to a broader audience. And football itself is an entry point to the topic of remembrance in this case. So could you please tell us a little bit about this resource as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, of course. A few months ago, we have published in cooperation with the Arolsen Archives and Andreas Kaas a small book, education material. It's named Football Players in Focus. And in this book, or in this material, there are 12 persecuted football players from all over Europe. And we tell their stories. And the idea is to have a deeper view on their story and start with like where they played, what was their history, what was their family situation, and then how was the persecution going on during the Second World War within the topic of these different countries. Like a player from Poland was targeted 6 years later than, for example, Julius Hirsch, who was a German Jewish national player. So the idea is to contextualize it and then work with these biographies and use the as a starting point to talk about the Holocaust and about the Second World War, use football players and to use the point of interest of football supporters, because they very often have a huge identification with their hometown. They have a huge identification with sports in general or with soccer in general. So we use this point of interest and address them with this 12 biographies. And within this material, one could also find concrete workshop offers in how to use this material and how to address or in which scenes to address the people or the supporters or the employees, for example. And I think it's it's for free, and everybody can find it on the page of Arolsen Archives, and maybe you can share it as well, Alina. And I try to keep it as short as possible.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you, Alina, and really thank you to all of the panelists. Unfortunately, we are beyond out of time, and with thanks to Yad Vashem Chairman Dani Dayan.